They pulled the bell free with gloved hands, and the sound failed to come. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw as sand fell from the bell slip and dust coated the leather gloves. Tarek reached for the obsidian bead that lay half buried beside the bell, and then opened his mouth and could not form a word. The assistant's throat moved, air left his lungs, but no sound emerged. The team circled the shrine under a low, washed-out dusk, and the central problem was clear. The objects behaved contrary to reason, and someone on the site had already paid a cost. The researcher crouched and pushed sand away from the carved step with a flat palm. He had led digs before, kept records with the same brass, bound journal tucked under his arm, but nothing in his training accounted for a piece of stone that swallowed speech. He produced a folding compass and checked bearings while Asha unwrapped a strip of linen and sounded the bead with her fingertip. "Asha," he said, "try to speak my name." Her voice came dry and low. "Asha," she repeated. Then she touched the bead and tried again. Her throat sealed and she exhaled without sound. The researcher felt the emotion root, suspicion shape his choices. He ordered hands away from the objects and moved methodically to secure evidence. They carried the finds back to camp with careful gestures. The bell sat on a canvas sheet between a headlamp and the journal. Tarek kept his hands near his throat and blinked as if testing a broken instrument. "Tarek, can you cough?" the researcher asked. He watched Tarek try to force a noise. The assistant's face flushed and his jaw worked. "I can tee." Tarek, writing characters on a scrap and sliding it across to the researcher. The scrap read, "I can feel air but nothing comes." The researcher set the obsidian bead in a padded box and wrote the catalog number in the margin of the field journal. Cataloging felt like an act of control. They ran a careful test. The researcher filled an oil lamp and set it between the bead and the bell, then asked Asha to speak into a recorder while he monitored the device. Asha the first line of the regional blessing, and the recorder captured a faint rustle. When the bead lay in the lamp, small pool of light. The waveform on the recorder flattened to near silence. The researcher tapped the waveform with a blunt pencil and the line stayed flat. He looked up at the sky where dusk was thickening. He spoke aloud, not to be theatrical but to record the fact. "Sound disappears near that bead." The words were plain. The data agreed. Asha paced the canvas like a woman assessing the stability of a roof. "We should leave," she said. "This opens things we do not understand here." The researcher answered with a gesture toward the journal and the bell. "We document it first," he said. "We do not abandon evidence." His voice carried a pragmatic steadiness that came from years of field discipline. Asha stopped and rubbed the back of her neck, where a faint scar showed beneath her hair. She had been quiet for weeks. The researcher knew she had reasons to be both loyal and cautious. Their exchange shifted the mood from measured curiosity to quiet unease. He set up lantern light and spread rubbings of glyphs and fragments beside the bell. The bell's surface held a carved band of shallow marks that matched none of the known pre-dynastic alphabets in his notes. The obsidian bead reflected the lamp's ring as a single tight wick of light. The rest of the stone absorbed it. He did not write that the bead seemed to drink illumination. He wrote instead, "Obsidian bead, matte surface, acoustic anomaly present." He pressed the brass seal into warm wax and stamped the evidence bag. His actions kept panic at bay. Tarek remained at the edge of the tent. He kept trying syllables and then scrawling them on scraps. "Tarek," the researcher said, bending close, "show me when you try to speak." Tarek pointed to his throat and then to the bell. He jabbed a finger at the bell and wrote, "The bell touched my chest before I lost voice." The scene gave rise to a new change in mood. Doubt shifted into alarm. The researcher lifted the bell to examine its clapper. The clapper consisted of a small obsidian tongue bound with a strip of bleached linen. The linen bore microscopic ash and a faint smear of a dark compound that tested positive for oxidized iron when the researcher used a field kit. He recorded the compound and photographed the smears with a macro lens. Night tightened around the camp. The researcher arranged a perimeter with small lanterns and marked locations in the journal by compass degrees. He left Tarek with water and instructed Asher to remain awake. "Asher," he said, "if anyone approaches, wake me immediately." She nodded and touched the pendant at her throat, where a narrow throat scar showed through fabric when she straightened. He watched her fingers press the scar as if checking a wound. Asher's hand closed and opened twice. Her behavior blinked between obedience and something else. The researcher had seen initiation marks before. A comparison took hold in his head and a new suspicion grew sharper. Asher's loyalty might not be to the camp. Halfway through the night, a distant procession moved along the dune rim. The researcher had his binoculars up and tracked the figures as they passed between low dunes and then halted at a distant cairn. They moved in strict formation and did not speak loudly. Their robes were pale in the starlight. The researcher packed his journal and slipped out, leaving Asher at the tent and telling Tarek to stay seated. He moved across sand that shifted underfoot and kept his breath controlled. He followed until one figure broke from the line and fled toward a cave mouth. The researcher pursued on a narrow dune slope and then spotted a bone necklace fall from the fleeing figure's hand and land in a shallow hollow. He crouched and picked it up. The necklace bore carved throat, scar glyphs. He returned to camp with the bone necklace held in both hands. Asher was awake and standing by the lab table. The researcher set the bone between them and then checked Asher's neck. She had been quiet and avoided his gaze. "Asher, show me your neck." She unbuttoned the collar of her linen shirt with slow fingers and revealed a thin, recent incision running along the base of her throat. "She did not deny it. "I am marked," she said. Her voice was low and controlled. "I was initiated weeks ago to listen for the silence." The researcher felt a fresh shift. Betrayal replaced mere unease. He put the bone necklace on the table and opened his palm to show the carved pattern. "These are the same cuts," he said. "You knew about the cult." Asher's expression tightened. "I did not tell you because you would stop us," she said. "You would take the objects away. They need protection." Her explanation contained more than one motive and fractured trust. They argued in short, clipped lines. "Asher, you endangered Tarek," the researcher said. "You brought us here." "I guided you to the shrine," she replied. "You dug it up." "We have a man who cannot speak," he said. "We must heal him and secure the site." "Healing requires silence," she answered. The back and forth escalated into a rapid exchange of 6 short lines. The researcher found his tone harder. He insisted they leave the bell and bead sealed until he could consult tribesmen and archives in the morning. Asher refused. She lifted a hand and placed it on the bell rather than on the evidence bag. "Let them complete a portion of the rite tomorrow night," she said. "If they do, they will not cause more harm to people near the shrine." Her face hardened in a way that showed resolve rather than fear. They left each other with a brittle truce. The researcher slept in short fits and woke to the sound of wind scurrying sand. He lay awake and opened the journal to sketch the necklace and the bead. He traced the rubbings of glyphs with a pencil and compared them to an archived rubbing that showed a partial incantation about the hush before first breath, a phrase he read literally in a damaged line. He did not write metaphors. He copied characters and measured stroke width and angle. The researcher stayed objective in the work to steady himself. Before dawn, the researcher walked back to the shrine with a small lantern. The procession had returned and now clustered around the central stone altar. He approached quietly and saw a ring of robed adherents kneeling without sound. One figure stood at the rim of the altar with a polished obsidian implement raised above a recessed black symbol in the stone. The researcher moved closer and the figure turned. He recognized the posture in his reconstruction of Keperu Sen. The researcher saw ritual scarification at the base of the neck and an obsidian inlay. He had reconstructed Keperu Sen on paper. Now the image moved. He stepped forward and called, "Stop." The voice sounded too loud in the hush. Bodies turned and one man stepped between the researcher and the altar. He held a hand out, "Stay back," the man said in a short line. The researcher kept walking. He reached for the obsidian implement to pry it from the man's grip. The man resisted. A brawl broke out in a tight ring. Sand flew, linen tore. Tarek lunged and gripped an adherent's arm. The researcher wrestled with another figure and felt fingers press hard against his forearm. The altar implement hit stone, and the recessed symbol caught a sliver of light and seemed to drink it. Asha moved with deliberate steps and pressed her palm to her chest. The climax unfolded fast and physically. Tarek fell to his knees and tried to shout. No sound came. His hands clawed at his throat. The researcher grabbed the bell and struck it hard. The strike produced no tone, only a sudden, low vibration that passed through his bones. That vibration was a physical sensation, like a pressure behind the ears. Asha stepped between the researcher and the implement and held it with two hands, pressing her face close to the implement's obsidian. She closed her lips and did not speak. The ritual faltered. One of the robed figures tried to leap toward the bell, and a scuffle sent the implement spinning across the altar. A woman in the crowd snatched it, and, with a single decisive motion, snapped the implement over the recess. The implement fractured into quarters. The moment ruptured. The adherents staggered back and began to chant a low hum without words, and the hum carried no audible pitch but produced a pressure in the chest for those close. The researcher had to take several steps away to steady his balance. Asha fell forward and crumpled beside Tarek. She folded her hands over her scar and kept her breathing steady. The researcher grabbed the torn journal page that had been tucked into an elder's robe and found glyphs that matched the ones in the shrine. He tried to read aloud a protective formula, but his lips felt heavy and the words labored. The chanting dissolved into movement as night animals stirred and the adherents broke the circle and dispersed across dunes. Dawn found them at the shrine steps. Tarek could not speak. He tried to point and scrawl, and then passed out for a moment from exhaustion. Asha sat with her forehead on her knees and tapped the base of her throat as if testing the wound. The researcher cleaned the fractured pieces of implement and put them into separate evidence bags. He photographed the broken implement and the recessed symbol until the light rose enough to show detail. He took a final rubbing of the symbol and taped it into the journal. He then opened the elder's torn journal page and read the line that described the rite. A step-by-step insertion of absence into a living throat to create a vessel for silence. The entry ended mid-sentence. The researcher felt a new shift in emotion. Alarm had become grim determination. He had to know whether the ritual could be completed. They returned to camp. The researcher set the obsidian bead in a small padded box and strapped it to his belt. He had the bead because it was evidence and because he suspected it was dangerous in situ. He sealed the bell in a cloth bag and wrote a clear note of chain, of custody. Asha watched him and then said, "You will not leave it in the open." She sounded steady. "I will keep watch," she said. The researcher replied, "Keep watch and do not touch the bead." She nodded without meeting his eyes. Questions swelled. Had she been protecting the site to preserve tradition or to safeguard a power? Had she betrayed the team? The answers would have to come from action, not conjecture. At the research table, the researcher sorted salvaged fragments. He found a torn page with a single intact paragraph that listed the rite stages and required items. Mute bell, obsidian implement, threaded bone necklace, the living throat scar. He compared the list to what they had uncovered. Everything for one complete rite existed now, except for a final item the paragraph hinted at but did not complete. The missing line suggested a vessel able to hold the silence whole. He felt a cold, practical thought. If someone reconstructed the last line, they could try again. The researcher taped the torn edge and underlined the fragment where the text broke. Asha watched him work and then spoke in short sentences. They thought silence would return the world to its first order, she said. They call it the hush before breath. Who is they? The researcher asked. The northern keepers, those who guard the rites near the estuary, she replied. She laced her fingers and the movement was quick. I was initiated there as a child. I took the mark to belong. The researcher measured her words and then said, "Why bring us here?" Asher met his eyes and answered, "So we could record the rite. So outsiders would know and limit harm." Her voice contained a stubbornness that did not match the secret she had kept earlier. The researcher felt another emotional shift. Betrayal softened into a pragmatic truce when she offered a motive that aligned with preservation. They catalogued each item and secured rope around the shrine steps. Tarek sat silent with a damp cloth at his throat. He wrote questions and tapped them on the table. "Tarek, what did you feel when you lost voice?" the researcher asked. Tarek wrote, "A cold pressure in the throat, then nothing." He drew a rough sketch of how the bead sat at the collarbone when he had touched it. The researcher compared that sketch to the obsidian inlay he had noticed at Keperu, Sen's reconstructed neck. He ran a hypothesis aloud. The bead may activate on contact with a throat scar. Asher's fingers tightened and she looked away. They planned to send a distilled sample of the iron compound to a lab in the nearest city, and to photograph the shrine for archival deposit. The researcher would transport the bead and the bell under lock to the field truck, and then proceed to the archive. Asher volunteered to stay and watch the shrine. "I will not let them complete it again," she said. "Trust me with the night watch." The researcher hesitated and then said, "Write your name on the chain of custody. Sign it as witness." She signed with a slow stroke and the line trembled. Before he left, the researcher fitted the bead into a padded box and placed the box against his chest. He tightened the strap and then looked up at Asher. "If you go to them," he said, "bring proof our work is transparent." She nodded. He turned toward the truck. The morning sun had burned off some of the cold and the sky was pale. He placed the evidence in the truck and closed the lid. When he reached for the journal, a gust lifted a loose page from the tent table, and it flipped open where a half-line of ritual script remained. The final instrument must be broken before the mouth may hold silence. He frowned and tucked the page into his jacket pocket for reading during the drive. The drive to the city left sand in the corners of the truck and a residue on the researcher's boots. He thought about the torn page, the fractured implement, and Tarek's voicelessness. He called the lab coordinator with 3 short sentences. "We have an acoustic anomaly. We need analysis. We will send a sample." The woman at the lab replied, "Send notes and a photo." He complied and then closed his laptop with a steady motion. He felt the weight of choices tighten. He would not leave the bead unexamined in the field, but removing it might provoke those who wanted it in place. He shifted from suspicion into a controlled resolve to follow evidence to its end. Back at camp that evening, a wind moved the dune sand in a thin sheet and the shrine lay empty. Asher kept watch, occasionally peering toward the cave mouth. Tarek slept under a thin blanket with his hand over his throat as if to test it. The researcher sat at the edge of the tent with a torn journal page spread on his knees. He traced the line where the sentence ended and then looked up at the horizon. The sun set cold, and the shard of ritual remained unanswered. He folded the torn page into the journal, placed the bead back into its padded box, and held on to the brass-bound book until he fell into a fitful sleep. When dawn arrived, the camp was quieter than it should have been. Asher and Tarek sat in the courtyard and watched the sunrise with eyes that darted frequently toward the shrine. Tarek mimed a handful of words and then dropped his hand. The researcher read the last line in the torn page aloud once more, and then clipped the page into the journal with a small scrap of stitched twine. He closed the journal and, in a concrete move to end the chapter's immediate conflict, he put the bead and the bell into a locked wooden crate with his name on the seal and left the crate on the table where Asher and Tarek could see it. "We secure it here," he said. "No one moves it without all signatures present." He set the crate lid and turned the key in the lock. Outside, the desert kept its wits. Inside the camp, the crater of tension narrowed into a single action. The locked crate, the torn page, the voiceless assistant, and a guide with a throat scar. The researcher sat and made a single, precise entry in the journal. Chapter 1, Shrine Disturbance, Actions Taken, Evidence Secured, Witnesses Present. He closed the journal. The final sentence of the chapter is not a reflection, but a concrete beat. A caravan appears on the dune trail beyond sight, and a runner calls the camp from the distance with 3 short shouts that split the morning into orders. The researcher rose, took the key, and walked toward the tent flap to receive the visitor. Asher shoved her shoulder against the sandstone lip and shoved the lamp down into the shaft before the occult researcher could stop her. The lamp hung at the end of her rope and the wick flared, then winked as if a hand had brushed the flame. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw. He stepped forward and felt the shaft air press against his face. Instruments had failed before, but not like this. The thermistor read steady room temperature, while the light diminished and the microphone picked up nothing but a flat line. Asher, hold it steady, and his voice sounded normal to him, which increased the suspicion that something there refused to cooperate with measurement. The occult researcher watched Asher lower the lamp another handspan. He listened to his own boots on the loose flagstones and counted the seconds with his breath. Suspicion drove him to check the gear rather than retreat. He tapped the camera casing. The red recording LED blinked, then went out when the lamp dipped lower. He ran his fingers over the obsidian inlay he had kept in his pocket and found the metal cold, which did not quiet his mind. "Tarek, light the second lamp," he ordered. The word light left his mouth like a tool instruction, not a plea. They had opened other sealed chambers earlier in the season. None had swallowed sound. The occult researcher kept a ledger in the front pocket of his jacket and a brass-bound field journal stuck to his hip. Those objects were concrete anchors. He flipped the journal open now and wrote 3 terse items: shaft opened, lamp stifled, instruments failing. He later returned to those notes and circled the word stifled twice. He did not use the term silence in the field notes because that word carried judgment. He used measurable language: lamp intensity, microphone output, camera LED. The choice reflected his method and his control under pressure. Asher's forearm creaked as she eased the lamp closer to a carved lintel. She called down, "I see something," a circle carved under the lintel. Her voice became low and halting near the last words. The rope whined as it shifted. The occult researcher leaned over the lip and peered into the mouth. A carved seal lay halfway down the shaft, its incisions filled with a dark residue that ate the lamp's reflection. He reached for a grab knife and prepared to descend, but not before Tarek and Dra. Nefru ran through equipment, checked protocols aloud in short, clipped phrases. At the camp later that night, the team discovered the artifacts refused to behave on their instruments. The black inlay, the bead Asher had found near the lintel, and a smear of the residue left the camera files as blank headers and the audio stamp as a line of zeros. Tarek tried to play back a recording and said, "It shows the timestamp but no waveform." He forced a short laugh and looked at the occult researcher. "Is this interference?" He asked Tarek. "It isn't normal interference, Dre." Nefru replied, "The metadata is intact, but the content is absent." The occult researcher watched the exchange and tightened the strap on his satchel. Asher sat with her knees drawn to her chest and did not speak. Her hands trembled when the bead sat on the table and made the air feel colder near her palms. The team had come prepared for old religious practice and for damage to sensors. They had not come prepared for items that made human speech fail. When Asher touched the bead to show Tarek, she opened her mouth to name the bead and the sound did not emerge. She swallowed once, then twice. Her throat worked. "Asher, The occult researcher. She pointed at her throat with a rigid index finger and shook her head. Her eyes were wide, not panicked, but focused. The occult researcher set down his brass, bound-field journal and felt the shift from suspicion to a colder concern. That concern altered his priorities. He ordered all artifacts moved to the lead-lined crate and locked it. Dr. Nefru worked the epigraphic rubbings in the field tent with precise hands. She had the steady breath of someone who copied letters for a living. She spread a half sheet over a raised inscription and rubbed charcoal along the clefts. "These marks are imperative forms," she said in a clipped voice, not raising her head. "They are not mere names. They instruct the actor to remove or to render unnamed what is spoken." The occult researcher paused, pen above paper, and felt a new emotional shift. Curiosity layered with alarm. He kept the curiosity professional. It required testable hypotheses. He read them aloud. Dr. Nefru did not read aloud. She whispered syllables into the air and then sealed the rubbing inside a folder. Tarek pounded at a recorder, then threw it away from him in frustration. "This is useless," he said. "If it destroys data, why keep it?" His anger was short and sharp. The occult researcher answered, "Because it offers a mode. If we can map the mode, we can predict it." The two men exchanged the kind of terse back and forth that sets plans in motion. Tarek's hands went to his hair and tugged once. "Predict how?" He snapped. "We either leave it buried, Tarek, or we provoke the mechanism and watch it take someone." Nefru cut in with 3 words: controlled, documented test. The occult researcher watched their faces. He realized he was the only one balancing risk with method. That realization tightened his chest like a band. He felt the emotion shift again. From alarm to the thin, practical resolve that structures experiments. They argued about the experiment into the small hours. The exchange followed the constraints the occult researcher set for all field disputes. Facts first, ethics second, then decisions. "We need a safe perimeter." Nefru, "We need instruments at the chamber rim, and a retrieval plan, and someone to enter." Tarek, "You expect me to go down a hole that eats sound?" "No, Dr. Nefru, not you." The occult researcher. The words hung in the tent. The occult researcher felt his posture change. He could hear his own breathing and found that his jaw had set. "I will not ask Asha to return. She is a guide, not a test subject." He turned his head to look at Asha. She sat pressed to herself and said nothing. The argument tightened into a 5-line rapid exchange as Tarek protested. Nefru insisted, and Asha watched with a look the occult researcher could not read. At dawn, under a sky that retained heat in banded layers, they prepared the circular altar for a reenactment. The team built a measuring ring with magnetometers and microphones spaced at precise radii. The occult researcher spoke each placement aloud. Mic 1 at chest height, Mic 2 at head height, magnetometer at stone lip, each line like a checklist. The inlay was placed at the center of the circle, and the bead lay in a small lead satchel above it. Nefru knelt to make a final rubbing and whispered an naming phrase she had translated from the glyphs. She kept her hands visible above the table the entire time. The ritual was to be a copy of the instruction with disclaimers. No voice uttered except the engineer's spoken prompts. Hands never crossed the center without harness, rope and retrieval in place. Asha stood outside the perimeter, arms folded. She brushed a strand of hair behind one ear, and the occult researcher saw her throat flex as she swallowed. She met his eyes briefly and gave a slight nod. The nod was not theatrical. It was an offered cooperation. The occult researcher felt the responsibility weigh on him and decided that the experiment would be as controlled as he could make it. He clipped his satchel strap and put his hand on the face of his brass-lined recorder. "Begin," he said. Nefru intoned the transliterated line in a voice that emphasized consonants and left vowels thin. She followed the glyphs in order and stopped at the point where the instruction called for an naming motion. The moment the final consonant finished, Asha's shoulders dropped. Her chest opened as if a breath she had not known she held had left her. Tarek's hand left the camera and his knuckles whitened. The magnetometer output showed a brief, flat plateau. The microphones registered a range of mechanical noise before the waveform narrowed and then almost disappeared. The absence manifested as a change of relation rather than a black hole. Instruments recorded data that described nothing. The occult researcher watched the waveform collapse and felt that the room had not become quiet. Instead, sound had been excluded from the system in a way that resembled a surgical excision. He retrieved the inlay now, he spoke with a clipped urgency meant to keep procedure. Tarek delivered the retrieval rope down the center and looped it around the inlay. The rope did not stay taut. It swung with a slow, unemotional arc. When Tarek hauled the object up, Asha's hand reached for it without permission and then froze. Asha's voice failed when she tried to name the inlay. She mouthed the consonants and then set her lips together. Her eyes shone with a serenity that alarmed the occult researcher more than panic would have. He put a gloved hand on her elbow and felt a quick, involuntary relax through her arm. Asha, can you tell me what you felt? She blinked slowly and pressed a finger to the base of her throat, where the high silent had worn ritual scars. I listened to nothing, she said finally, one short sentence. The words were plain, but the physical manner of saying them, a soft flatness, the placement of a palm, showed that something in Asha had changed. The occult researcher made a note in his journal. Subject altered, voice reduced, ritual markings appearing. When Tarek collapsed, his legs folded beneath him without warning. He had been holding the recorder, and its strap dug a pale line into his palm. He hit the ground with a light thump and then lay still, breath in shallow cycles. Dudra? Nefru leaned over him and checked for pulse. He's breathing, she said. Her voice had a controlled panic that kept measurements going. The occult researcher crouched and placed an ear to Tarek's chest and counted. The count was ragged. He felt a different emotion then, responsibility shifting toward guilt if he could not explain or reverse this effect. That emotion altered his behavior. He grabbed the lead satchel with the bead and took it far from Tarek's head. In that pre-dawn chamber, the occult researcher had his most direct encounter with what the cult called the High Silent. He did not see Keperu, Sen as a living man. He perceived him as a reconstructed presence. Images in a rubbing, the posture suggested by scarification, the obsidian clapper described in myth. The presence arrived not as a figure but as a command restructuring the space. The occult researcher found himself mirroring the High Silent's ritual posture, pressing his palm to his chest the way the reconstructed persona had done in iconography. He recognized the posture and then interrupted himself. He adjusted his position and focused on measurable variables. The moment forced a split. An anthropological reverence in one muscle and a scientist's recoil in another. When the chamber settled, the instruments were intact, but returned files that described an absence with numerical precision. A drop in spectral energy in the recorded band, a null in acoustic content, a steady magnetometer reading with no harmonic signatures. Dre. Nefru catalogued each data set with short declarative labels. The absence is repeatable under conditions we set. Her voice was level. Tarek lay on his side with a bruise on his temple and a trickle of blood at his hairline. Asha had new, faint ritual markings near her collarbone that matched the diagram in Jurta Nefru's epigraphic notes. The occult researcher felt the emotional current shift one last time in the wake. From active resolve to a bleak clarity that some truths carried cost. They left the inner chamber at dawn with the instruments packed and Tarek carried on a blanket. The team crossed the wind, scorched slope in compact formation. Asha walked with a measured step and a placid expression that obscured what had happened to her voice. Druta Nefru insisted on an interim report. She spoke plainly. We will sanitize sensitive items and sequester them. We will not take the inlay out of the site until we have a secure facility, the occult researcher agreed. He watched her hands as she wrapped the rubbings, and muttered acronyms for decontamination. He thought of the ledger he had circled in camp and felt the pull to bury anything that might be misused. On the final steps of the shrine, the occult researcher stopped. He had sealed a partial report in a small metal tube and buried it beneath a flagged stone as a contingency. He rewound the small rope and set the lamp at the edge. There, in the shifting morning light, he noticed a single obsidian bead half, buried in the sand where a foot had brushed the lip. It sat in the shallow hollow like a polished bruise. He crouched and brushed sand from it with a thumb. The bead absorbed the morning glare without reflecting it. He thought of the instrument Knowles and of Asher's inability to name. He felt a residue of dread, precise and cold, but also a practical decision forming in him. He would remove the bead and carry it away in the lead-lined crate. He placed the bead in his pocket with the same care he used to stow field samples. The act of pocketing it ended the chapter's immediate conflict. They left the site that day with Tarek wrapped and quiet, Asher walking between them with one hand at her throat, and Drea, Nifru cataloguing the rubbings and the partial data sets. The occult researcher kept his journal open and wrote, in block letters, experiment enacted, absence manifested, subject altered, bead recovered. He closed the journal and looked across the sun, scrubbed plain. He did not speak the word conclusion. He knew a single reenactment did not provide closure. He had, however, settled the chapter's small moral problem. The team had tested the mechanism and survived with losses. He carried their choices home in his hands and in his notes. Asher's voice remained limited for the next watch. She made short oral attempts and then signed phrases with small, tidy gestures. The occult researcher learned to read the rhythm of her hands. She started saying single names again after 3 days, consonant, heavy and deliberate. Stone, night, Tarek, her fingers kept the rest. The occult researcher saw the ritual markings at the base of her throat and felt a professional obligation to document them photographically. She did not object. The camera recorded the images, but the file metadata again showed an absence where any ambient sound should have existed. This continued to underline the strange law the team confronted. The cult's absence was transferable, consistent, and resistant to casual explanation. The chapter closed not with answers, but with a sequence of concrete acts. The occult researcher sealed the partial report in the metal tube and hid it beneath the flagged stone. He wrapped Tarek's head and set him in the shade. He guided Asher to sit and handed her water. He put the obsidian bead into the lead-lined crate and locked it. He walked down the shrine steps and found, with a quiet, procedural caution, that the bead had absorbed the light. He placed the crate into the transport case and latched it. The final movement was deliberate. He paused at the top step, brushed sand from the lip with a thumb, and closed his fingers on the ledge. The day had resolved the chapter's experiment, but the bead's presence on his person implied the threat endured. He stepped away from the shrine and carried their decisions forward into the next stage of investigation. They seized the acolyte before he could step away from the terrace railing. The glass lamp at Tarek's belt chimed against the stone, and then the sound died when the acolyte's fingers found a circular recess. Asher grabbed the man's arm and could not set a single word in his mouth. Suspicion drove the occult researcher's first moves. He stepped forward, palms on the warm sandstone, and watched the obsidian bead settle into the carved cup. He reached for the bead with a gloved hand and felt the air tighten under his fingertips. He had come to this site because of those earlier anomalies. He remembered the bell from the first dig. They had pulled it with gloves and expected a ring. The bell gave no tone. He remembered the lamp Asher had lowered into the shaft, and the flame that flared, then winked out as if someone had pinched it. Those two failures of ordinary sound had been concrete, physical failures. Metal that did not vibrate, a flame that failed to feed oxygen. Those memories bent his choices now. Suspicion, an insistence that something in the place interfered with ordinary instruments, drove him to seize evidence, rather than theoretical explanations. Hold him. The occult researcher, voice flat. Tarek, check the throat. Asher, watch his hands. His commands were short, direct actions to test a concrete risk. Tarek moved in, fingers quick, and found fresh scarification along the acolyte's throat. He hissed, "There are cuts here." "He can't speak." Asher's shoulder bumped the carved lip, and the lamp on her rope hung suspended in the empty air below. The wick glowed, then vanished without sputter. The absence of noise had become a material hazard. They moved the acolyte into the narrow passage beneath the terrace. He was not resisting. His eyes darted fixed, as if tracking a sound no one else could hear. He leaned his head to one side with the same habit Keperu, Sen always showed, tilting as if listening for nothing. And the familiar gesture made the occult researcher lower his hand from the obsidian bead. Fear pushed through curiosity. The team had planned to observe, measure, and collect. Now they had to prevent harm. At the makeshift lab, the occult researcher placed the bead on a sheet of field paper and opened his brass-bound journal. He wrote one precise line: obsidians, light-absorbing context, ritualized vacancy. He did not pencil metaphors. He turned the bead under the lamp and watched the oil reflect no light from the bead's surface. It ate the lamp's halo and returned only a dull rim around the stone. "It is matte," he said. "It absorbs light and sound interference follows." Tarek tapped the bead with the end of a bone probe. No click answered. The probe landed and made contact. The metal did not vibrate. Asher left her hands on the bead for a moment and then withdrew them. She kept her fingers stiff. "It pulled at my jaw when I tried to speak," she said. "My throat shut down." Her words came out measured. She used names when she spoke. "Tarek, you saw the scarification. Occult researcher, what do you want to do with it?" The occult researcher closed the journal with a soft metal snap, then opened to a map. He traced the terrace and the inner chamber. The new glyph etched on the bead matched a variant he had sketched after they found the first seal. He tapped the paper where they had drawn the image of the bell that gave no ring. "This is an adapted instrument," he said. They reduced the seal to a token. "It can travel. It can be placed against a surface and the sight's absence will follow." They argued quietly about containment. "We should bag the bead and remove it from sight," Tarek urged. "We can transport it to the field lab and lock it in lead." His sentences were clipped with urgency. Asher shook her head, moving it risks spreading the pattern. "If the cult can induce this outside the shrine, they could silence a village." She stated a clear consequence and stood so the lamp light threw a line across her jaw. The occult researcher studied both of them, then spoke. "We will not move it today. We document, then we plan a controlled neutralization with Keperu, Senna's informant if necessary." He set the journal on the table and tapped the page where he had written the bell and the lamp incidents. His plan was a choice to buy time. They kept the acolyte under watch and let him sleep, eyes half-lidded, in a narrow cot. He woke, reached for the bead in his sleep, and Asher startled up to block him. The acolyte startled awake and tried to speak. Nothing came out. He mouthed a single syllable with no sound. Tarek pressed a water flask to his mouth. The acolyte performed the motion of drinking without consuming a drop. The action felt like an instruction rather than a need. The team made careful notes, then the occult researcher took the bead to the terrace to examine the recess. He moved deliberately, hands steady. The terrace's sandstone held radial grooves. The carved cup matched the bead's shape. He calibrated his compass and measured distance. He placed the bead in the cup and waited for a reaction. Nothing mechanical occurred. The bead fit and stayed. Then Asher's lamp went out along the stair, and the terrace fell quiet as a sealed room. The silence was not merely the lack of voices. It registered on instruments. The field recorder registered a flat line. The compass needle trembled and stopped for 2 heartbeats, and the brass-bound journal's pen left a shallow, inkless groove on the page when he tried to mark the position. The team felt a first emotional pivot. Suspicion shifted into alarm. The occult researcher had expected mystery. He had not expected instruments to fail. He reacted by taking notes with a blunt pencil pressed into the paper until the graphite left an indentation. He used physical measures when words would not suffice. They brought the acolyte back to the inner chamber and secured him in the narrow passage. He crouched against the sandstone wall and kept pressing a palm to his throat. The occult researcher crouched opposite and said, "Tell me who taught you." The acolyte opened his mouth and made a long, voiceless breath. He shook his head and tried again. Asher bent close and said, "Asher asks, who is the high silent?" The acolyte's pupils widened. He traced a finger along his bone necklace and pointed toward the pit. Tarek cursed softly. "Keperu, Sen," he said, "he is not dead." That disclosure forced them into a new course. Keperu. Sen had appeared in whispered reconstructions. The high priest with the obsidian inlay, the face mask, the scarification at the throat. Until now, Keperu, Sen had been an absent figure in their reports, a reconstructed persona. The acolyte's gesture made him concrete again. The occult researcher felt a second emotional shift. Alarm curdled into a taut determination. He moved to the pit's rim and looked into the opening where no echo rose. He listened for small details of movement. Sand sliding breath, cloth rubbing stone. He felt the compulsion to intervene. Asher slipped away alone after dusk. She tied her lamp to a rope and descended into the inner chamber while the rest of the team argued about procedures. The occult researcher noticed her absence, cursed and followed. He found her at the rim of the silent pit, standing very still with the obsidian clapper in her hand. Her fingers trembled. She would not speak. The sight snapped him into an immediate, sharp argument with himself. Should he approach and seize the implement? Or allow the ritual to proceed, to observe? "Asher, move away from the rim," he said, voice steady but edged. She looked at him, and the same compulsion showed in the tilt of her head. She raised a palm to her chest and pressed it flat. Asher says, "I was called back." She managed in single, whispered syllables, each one urgent. Something pulled me. Before he could reach her, a figure rose at the rim. Keperu, Sen. He appeared from the crate of carved steps, as if he had been there all along, linen wraps folded, the obsidian mask in his hand. He did not speak. He tilted his head and made the slow, deliberate gesture of listening that the team now knew too well. He stepped closer to the pit and gestured with the clapper's obsidian head toward the hole. "Keperu, Sen, the occult researcher, you will not finish this. You will not take another person." His voice intended to demand and to test whether the man would respond to words. "Keperu," Sen made a small motion with his hand and took 2 steps back. He set the face, mask against his chest and lifted the clapper. His movement contained no oath and no explanation. He placed the clapper against the rim and struck once. The sound did not travel. It was absorbed by the stone. Instruments around them stuttered. Lamps went dim. The recorder registered silence. The compass trembled and spun slowly again. A matte darkness fanned from the pit, and the air became a thing pressing on the skin. The occult researcher lunged forward to seize Keperu, Sen. He reached out and his hand met linen and bone. Keperu, Sen's palms were cool. Asher's eyes went wide. Her mouth formed a syllable that left no sound. Tarek stepped in between and tried to grab the clapper. His fingers closed on the shaft, and then his hand went slack. He tried to speak and only mouthed, "Stop," with no audible response. They fought in the only way left, with physical restraint. The occult researcher twisted and pulled, feeling the fabric and bone under his fingers. He shoved Keperu, Sen back from the rim, while Tarek dragged the clapper from the high silence grip. The motion was ugly and concrete. Fingers snagged on anklets of compressed bone, rings clawed at linen, scarified skin scraped sandstone. Keperu, Sen's face did not change. He pressed a palm to his chest and made a slow, deliberate tilt of his head, as if to say that he had already heard what he wanted to hear. The climax collapsed into a single, violent mechanical failure. The clapper broke where it met Tarek's hand, and a scatter of obsidian fragments skittered into the pit. Sound stopped in a way they could not measure. Voices stalled mid-word. The lamp flame bent and went out, and the recorder picked up a flat emptiness. The occult researcher felt his lungs compress, as though a band tightened across his ribs. He grabbed at the journal with a shaking hand and found his pen would not leave ink. He struck the flint on his compass and found only a soft spark that went out. When sound returned, it did so in a staggered, partial way. Asha coughed and then began to cry, the first audible sound tearing from her throat. Tarek opened his mouth and could not speak for several long breaths. Keperu Sen sat on the rim, hands folded. He removed his mask and did not wipe his face. His throat bore the same ritual scarification the acolyte had. He looked at the scattered fragments in the pit, and then at the occult researcher. He lifted his chin and, in a voice that had been withheld until then, let out a whisper that all who heard felt as a physical pressure. It was always meant to be quiet. They assessed damage immediately. Instruments were ruined. The field recorder's diaphragm had ruptured. The lamp reservoirs leaked. The compass was magnetically altered. Tarek found his voice returning in staccato lines. Tarek says, "The fragments, some are gone. The altar is missing 3 beads. He the names aloud," Tarek says. Someone removed them during the invocation. That was the surprise that changed the playable field. The team had assumed the ritual required the intact set of obsidian to function. Now 3 beads were missing. The occult researcher felt a sharp economic calculation in his chest. The cult had adapted a portable mechanism and also learned to steal components mid-rite. Suspicion hardened into a new plan. He ordered the camp secured and sent 2 men north along the dune track to look for footprints. He kept Keperu Sen seated and told Asha to inventory the altar. At the courtyard they worked fast. The occult researcher catalogued the ruined instruments, then sat with Keperu Sen and asked direct, short questions. "He who taught you the variant glyph? Where do the beads leave the site?" Keperu Sen's responses were gestures and very sparse words. Keperu Sen says. "The vow travels," he whispered. Keperu Sen says. Silence follows who offers it. Each answer tightened the stakes. Tarek reported back with a discovery. He had followed a faint drag mark toward the east and found a dozen small, dark beads half buried in a wind shelf. Asha photographed their positions. The occult researcher held 1 bead between thumb and forefinger and pressed it to the journal's page. The stone left a faint, inkless mark just by contact. He placed the bead back in his palm, closed the journal, and felt the grit of sand on his skin. They argued next steps for the last time before dawn. Asha wanted to destroy the beads on sight. Tarek wanted to transport them in lead-lined cases. The occult researcher split the difference and instructed a controlled burn for the scattered beads while retaining the one from the altar for study. We will destroy what we can without moving the altar bead. We keep one for analysis and watch the network." He staged the burn in a shallow pit with a windbreak and supervised as the beads blackened and fractured into grains. The chapter closed with a concrete event. The occult researcher walked the courtyard steps alone, boots kicking loose grit down into the dim of the stairs. He picked up a single obsidian bead that had lodged between 2 steps and turned it over in his palm. He slid the bead into an inner pocket of his satchel, set the brass-bound journal atop it, and closed the clasp. He then lifted his folding compass, set its needle to an angle toward the nearest settlement where the drag marks trailed, and started walking away from the shrine toward the dunes. The sound of his boots on the sandstone returned steady and human behind him. Emotion root. Suspicion had compelled his first choices and guided all subsequent actions. Doubt became alarm, then resolved into determined containment. The chapter showed 2 clear emotion shifts. Suspicion to alarm to determination, and later alarm to urgent planning to grim resolve. The occult researcher acted through measurement, commands, and choices rather than speeches. He spoke in short directives. He catalogued evidence with his hands, and he let the physical world, the broken clapper, the missing beads, the ruined recorder, shape the team's next move. They left the inner chamber cleaned of equipment and marked with ropes. Keperu, Sen remained seated on the rim, watched but not restrained beyond a line of cord. The team moved with practical gestures. Asher secured straps on the cases, Tarek tethered lamps in pairs, and the occult researcher logged coordinates. Each action was designed to reduce the chance of another invocation during transport. The chapter resolved its central conflict, the attempted completion of the rite, by stopping the high silent before it could finish and by accounting for the cost. Ruined instruments, 3 missing beads, and 1 recruit rendered voiceless. A mid-chapter cliffhanger had appeared when Asher slipped alone to the rim with the clapper. That moment forced the occult researcher into an immediate decision and precipitated Keperu, Sen's appearance. The unexpected reveal that beads were missing changed earlier assumptions and created a new operational priority. A search for a network rather than a single shrine. The chapter ends on a specific, physical beat, the occult researcher pocketing an obsidian bead and setting his compass toward the dunes, an action that turns the excavation into pursuit and keeps the narrative moving. Outside, dawn slid thin light across the sandstone. Sand clung to the occult researcher's boots as he left the courtyard. He did not make promises aloud. He tightened the satchel strap, checked the amulet at his throat, and began the walk east, counting steps and plotting where the missing beads might have been carried next. The team followed in measured, practical lines behind him, boots cutting the soft ridges of shifting sand as they moved from excavation to investigation. Keperu, Sen raised the matte obsidian clapper over the rim and the occult researcher thrust both palms forward, catching the priest's wrist hard enough to sting. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as sand sifted off the clapper and a line of acolytes froze on the terrace. Suspicion was the momentum that had driven him across dunes and through archives. It pushed his body into that grip and into the first confrontation of the morning. He had seen part of this pattern before. The bell that made no sound in the first chamber, the lamp that winked out when it crossed a threshold, the acolyte who could not say a single syllable when his fingers found the stone rim. Those concrete failures of sound had become a chain of evidence. Now the chain pulled taut above an open pit. The researcher kept both hands on Keperu, Sen's wrist, and did not let go. Keperu, Sen, the researcher, voice even but clipped. You will not do this here. His fingers were steady. His pulse still showed in his throat. Keperu, Sen did not answer in words. He tilted his head and held the clapper, as if listening to silence. Asher shoved at the researcher's shoulder and spoke while she moved. Let go. Asher, let him end it if he will. Her voice had a sharp edge. The researcher saw the way her forearms flexed beneath linen wraps, the way the beads at her throat caught dust. They argued in short lines beneath the dawn edge. Asher, the researcher, you saw the throat. Glyph, I saw it, Asher replied. I know what it asks. Tarek stepped between them. Breath visible in the cold air, and said, Tarek 1T, let you take her down. Keperu, the names clipped into the air like the quick strokes of a field notebook. The researcher repeated each as a tether to reality. The immediate conflict, stop the rite or allow it to complete, was concrete and urgent. It framed the entire morning. When the researcher forced Keperu, Sen's wrist down, a small clatter of loose beads shuffled across the priest's belt. Keperu, Sen's hand pressed palm, first to his chest in a slow ritual motion. The researcher remembered the bell without sound. He felt its absence like a stain under his nails. He took 2 steps back and said, You started this in the shrine. You pulled the bell free and there was nothing. You dropped the lamp and the flame died. We are not here to finish what kills words. His voice hardened into resolve. Suspicion shifted into a quieter dread. Keperu, Sen tilted his face toward the pit and spoke a single word, more breath than voice. The sound did not travel. It seemed to die within his lips. The acolytes around the terrace made no move. Their breathing measured and shallow was the only sign of life. Asher cursed and pushed past the researcher, seizing the obsidian bell from the priestess sash, Asher, the researcher, reaching. But she had already stepped to the stone steps and began her descent. The moment she put weight on the first step, a different reaction moved across the group. Tarek's hand flew to his throat, and he could not form a single syllable. An external event changed the dynamic. The acolyte at the terrace rail slapped his palm against stone where a circular recess hid, and the glass lamp at his belt chimed and then fell silent. That earlier event, recorded in the researcher's journal from Chapter 3, had been a specific failure of speech. Now it repeated and scaled. The researcher felt a new heat behind his eyes, a practical dread that translated into action. He began to descend after Asher. He moved with deliberate, grounded steps, keeping his hands where he could push or catch. Inside the collapsed shrine alcove, the researcher pried loose the throat, glyph from its broken lintel. He held the carved sandstone tile between thumb and forefinger. The glyph's shallow grooves were filled with old ash. He read the instruction aloud to himself because the letters made sense when sounded, and because reading them allowed him to track his own voice. The glyph required creation of a living silence through a specific motion, a press to the throat and a release into the pit timed to the rising sun. That instruction changed the stakes. A sacrifice, not metaphorical silence, but a literal removal of speech through blood, was demanded. The revelation created a new split in the group's choices. It says bind the voice with blood, the researcher, holding up the tile so Asher and Tarek could see. It asks for a living silence. Asher's jaw set. Tarek's eyes flicked to the pit and then to Keperu Sen. Keperu Sen. Tarek, voice compressed. This would restore order. What do you mean by this? Keperu Sen's hands remained steady on the rim. He lifted the obsidian clapper and tapped it once against his collarbone. The sound failed to exist. Emotion shifted again, suspicion bent into bargaining. Asher stepped forward and struck a loose shard of stone against the clapper, driving a small shower of grit. If you want silence, Asher, voice raw. Let it be offered by stone, not by flesh. She pushed the clapper back toward Keperu Sen and then seized it. Tarek grabbed her wrist. Asher, wait. He did not say it softly. He said it because he had witnessed what the pit took in silence. Asher's face did not change. She pressed the clapper to her palm and looked down the steps. Asher's choice arrived fully formed. She slid the obsidian bell into a leather loop at her waist with one motion and announced, I will go down. I will take the clapper and break this knot of voice. The researcher forced himself to listen to the syllables without turning them into an argument immediately. Asher stepped onto the stone steps. Tarek reached for her arm. Do not, he said. Asher, you cannot. She drove an elbow in her shoulder in a single clean move and walked past him. The descent into the pit changed the balance of power. When Asher's fingers brushed the stone rim that marked the threshold, a faint blackness pooled at the contact point and then withdrew like a tide. The researcher watched the skin of her fingers blanch and then regain color. Sound did not travel well at that moment. When she called, Tarek, the name arrived as a breath and then stopped. Tarek made a noise, an attempt, and then found his mouth empty. The acolyte who had lost speech in Chapter 3 blinked and turned away from the rim, unable to form even a hiss. This new event created terror in practical terms. Equipment failed, names could not be spoken, commands could not be given. The researcher could not radio for help because their field radios returned only static when brought close to the pit. He pulled his folding compass from his satchel and opened it. The needle trembled and then did not settle. The physical world refused the usual reference. The researcher moved his hand to the brass-bound journal at his belt and thumbed it open. He wrote one line in swift block letters. Throat, glyph. Requires living silence. The pit's reaction escalated. Asher reached the lowest step and crouched, holding the clapper to her mouth. She looked once at the researcher and used a single, deliberate motion. She pressed the clapper against her throat and drove it inward. The movement was precise, practiced. She did not cry out. The researcher lunged, but Tarek shoved him aside to take the blow of momentum. The clapper struck flesh and sank a fingertip's depth. The sound of Asher's breath vanished. For a full instant nothing happened, and then the pit exhaled on its own, an absence drawn like a vacuum, and a thin, dry wind pulled dust into the hollow. Keperu, Sen's face held the same calm as before. He pressed his palm to his chest. The climax arrived in motion and violence. Keperu, Sen took the priestly obsidian implement from the shrine and stepped forward. He pressed it to his throat and began the final stroke required by the glyph. The researcher dove, catching the priest's wrist with both hands. Asher threw herself between them, pushing the edge of her shoulder against the priest's chest. The instrument scraped. Blood-wetted linen. The ritual reached its peak. Voices fractured into short, broken sentences. Keperu, Sen, the researcher, fingers pressed to the priest's wrist. Stop this now. You cannot stop what was begun, Keperu. Sen murmured. Keperu, Sen, listen to me, Asher. Breathless. Asher, hold. Tarek barked, terse and sudden. The back and forth rushed for a handful of lines. 3, 4, 5 interjections that collided and revealed their priorities. Then the clapper broke contact with the priest's throat and fell into the pit mouth with a dull, swallowed sound. Something unexpected happened. The pit accepted the edge of Keperu, Sen's breath, but rejected a complete transfer. The ritual executed partially. The pit seized a single inhalation and held it like a pebble. Keperu, Sen's face slackened. He staggered backward, then sank to his knees. Asher slumped against the terrace lip as if sudden weakness had unmoored her, blood on her linen. Tarek dropped to his knees and began to haul the researcher away from the rim. The researcher felt the tug of desert sand at his boots and tasted metal at the back of his mouth. After the violent center, the group needed earthen, practical actions. Tarek dragged Asher back from the steps and eased her onto the terrace. He tore a strip of linen from his own wrap and tied it to her throat to staunch bleeding where the bell had nicked and to hold pressure. Asher, look at me. Tarek, voice urgent. Asher, can you hear me? She opened her eyes and blinked. She could not push sound through her lips. Her hands flexed and she pointed at the pit. She tried to mouth a single name and failed. Here the researcher moved from recorder to guardian. He examined the pit's rim and the broken pieces of carved stone and found a shallow channel carved outward from the mouth. He traced it with a finger and realized the channel had been designed to divert spilled liquids in a ritual of binding. The glyph on the lintel had not only demanded a throat press, it had provided a mechanical safeguard against full completion by channeling the first sound away. That built-in limitation explained the partial failure. The cult had engineered their rite with a deliberate margin, a way to take sound without allowing the whole world to fall silent at once. The researcher wrote the observation into his journal, each letter measured and intentional. Emotion shifted again. Dread moved toward resolve. The researcher felt grief when he looked at Asher's open eyes and could not hear her voice. Grief tightened into clear action. He knelt and took a small bone bead from her necklace, an item Keperu, Sen had worn in the earlier ceremonies, and pressed it into Asher's palm. He then took the obsidian bead that had fallen from the priest's sash and held it between forefinger and thumb. He tested its edge and found a faint matte quality that absorbed light. He wrapped the bead in oilcloth and slid it into his satchel. This concrete transfer of a relic marked a change in strategy. Tarek began to pack equipment to move Asher to shade. Keperu, Sen, face creased with something that was nearly regret, rose slowly and said a few measured sounds into his hands. They were not words the researcher could reconstruct. They were ritual syllables meant for the pit. The priest then stepped away from the rim and, for the first time since the morning began, removed his obsidian face mask. The face beneath was gaunt and lined with scars. The inlaid stone at the base of his neck caught the noon light. The failed completion had another twist. When Keperu Sen pulled his hand away, a strip of old linen dropped from his wrist and revealed a second throat, glyph, inked in a pattern identical to the carved stone. The researcher had assumed the cult used only architectural marks. Instead, the ritual had also been worn on bodies. That revelation altered how the researcher understood past events. The bell that made no sound in the first chamber had been handled by an acolyte with the glyph on his wrist. The lamp that had winked out had been held by a woman with the glyph sewn into her collar. The partial success at the pit now explained the systematic pattern of silences they had witnessed across the site. Asha could not speak, but she could act. She grabbed the researcher's journal with one hand, flipped to a fresh page, and began to scrawl in quick block letters. Her handwriting was jagged but legible. She wrote 2 lines, and the researcher read them aloud. "Do not leave the bead near open throats. Do not let the glyph be worn again." Her eyes were fierce. The researcher nodded and packed the journal back into his satchel. He tied Asha's bandage tighter and wrapped oilcloth around the sand, dark wound. By midday, the group had moved from crisis response to reconstruction. They set up a collapsed archive tent on the terrace and began recording what had happened. The researcher dictated observations while Tarek arranged salvaged fragments of carved stone onto a clean cloth. They labeled each fragment with a quick code. The researcher insisted on photographing the pit mouth from 3 fixed angles and then burying the clapper's remains in a sealed crate. "We will catalogue every symbol," he said. "We will map the throat, glyph distribution." Tarek answered, "We will burn any worn glyphs we find on clothing." And then he hesitated and added, "Unless we are ordered otherwise by the elders." The researcher marked the hesitation. The researcher had a new purpose. He had arrived as a recorder. He left the terrace with a duty to act as a guardian against future invocations. He did not say this in a speech. He performed it through concrete steps. Sealing the clapper remnants, wrapping the obsidian bead, and placing both into his brass-bound journal's inner pocket. He wrote the final line of that day's entry. "The silence functions as political technology. It erases testimony and confines power." He watched the ink dry and then closed the journal. They left the shrine in late afternoon. Asha leaned on Tarek's shoulder and walked with a bandage at her throat. Keperu Sen walked ahead alone for a while, then turned his head and watched them go. The researcher held the obsidian bead in his palm until the last light thinned, and then slid it into the satchel next to his journal. He pressed the flap closed and tightened the brass clasp until it clicked. The final concrete beat arrived before they reached the dunes. The researcher paused at the first rise of sand, set the satchel against a flat stone, and drew the bead out once more. He set it on top of the journal's closed pages, then took a photograph with the field camera. The bead, the journal, Asha's bandage in the background, Tarek's hand on her shoulder. He wrote a caption beneath the photo in his ledger. "Bead recovered. Partial rite. 1 priest lost breath. 1 acolyte silenced. Retain custody." The action sealed the chapter's resolution. They had stopped the ritual's full completion, recorded the evidence, and removed the central relic into guarded hands. The researcher did not frame his work with rhetoric. He put the bead back in the satchel, slung it across his shoulder, and took one last look at the shrine. He felt grief for what had happened to Asha and a measured iron resolve that would guide his next steps. He rose, closed the satchel, and began the walk down the dune path toward the encampment. The final paragraph of the morning was simple and concrete. He tightened the satchel strap, felt the bead's rounded edge press into the journal through the cloth, and stepped into the lowering light with the bead hidden against his ribs.